The fog was thick enough to cut with a knife when I first drove into town. The kind of mist that clings to your clothes and chills your bones. I'd been to a lot of small towns before, places tucked away from the rest of the world, but there was something different about this one. Even the name, St. Hilda's, felt like it belonged to another time. Somewhere buried in the past and maybe better left there. As I rolled in, the streets were empty. The houses sat close together, like they were huddling for warmth, with windows that seemed to watch me pass by. It didn't help that the sun had already started its slow descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across the cobblestone roads. My GPS had given up a while back, so I was relying on old-fashioned directions, scribbled hastily on the back of a receipt. According to those directions, the convent was supposed to be up ahead, just beyond the edge of town. When I first saw it, looming in the distance, I felt a strange shiver crawl up my spine. The convent was ancient, built from dark stone that seemed to drink in the last rays of sunlight. It sat on a rise overlooking the town, as if it were keeping a close watch on everything below. A high, wrought iron gate stood at the entrance, rusted with age but still imposing. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving this place behind. But I had a job to do, and something about the stories I'd heard drew me in, even though every instinct told me to get out while I still could. I parked the car and approached the gate. It creaked loudly when I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the still air. The path leading up to the convent was lined with dead, gnarled trees that twisted towards the sky like skeletal hands. My footsteps crunched on the gravel as I made my way to the large wooden doors, which stood slightly ajar. The scent of incense and old wood filled my nostrils as I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by flickering candles, casting long, dancing shadows across the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something else, something I couldn't quite place. As I stood there, taking in the eeriness of the place, I heard the soft shuffle of footsteps approaching. A figure appeared from the darkness, a young woman dressed in a simple habit. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a world of sadness. "Are you Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes," I replied, still trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had gripped me since I arrived. "I'm here to write about the convent, the history, the stories." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm Sister Helena. I'll show you around. But there's something you should know first." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I waited, but she hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "This place, it's not what it seems. There are things here, things that can't be explained." I didn't know what to say. I had come expecting tales of old ghosts, maybe a few eerie legends. But the way she spoke, the fear in her eyes, it made my skin crawl. She looked at me as if she could see right through me, like she was searching for something deep inside. "I've been having visions," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "Terrible visions. And I think they're trying to tell me something. Or maybe they're warning me." Before I could respond, she turned and began walking down the dimly lit corridor, her footsteps echoing softly in the silence. I hesitated for a moment, then followed, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I'd come to uncover the truth behind the stories, but as I stepped deeper into the shadows of the convent, I began to wonder if I was ready for what I might find. Sister Helena led me through the narrow, winding corridors of the convent. The place felt like a maze, each turn revealing another stretch of cold, stone walls and more flickering candles. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on us, thick with the weight of centuries of secrets. We finally reached a small, dimly lit room at the end of a hallway. It looked like a chapel, but not the kind you'd expect in a place of worship. The room was bare except for a simple wooden altar, a few rows of rough-hewn benches, and a large, imposing crucifix on the wall. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, almost suffocating, and there was a strange chill that seemed to seep into my bones. "This is where it started," Helena said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood by the altar, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she was trying to steady herself. The visions, the dreams, everything. I moved closer, noticing the way her eyes darted nervously around the room, like she was expecting something to jump out of the shadows. "What do you see in these visions?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though my own nerves were fraying at the edges. "At first, they were just flashes," she said, her voice trembling. "Faces I didn't recognize, places I'd never been. But then they started to get darker. I saw blood, so much blood. And then, I saw her." "Her?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Helena's eyes flicked up to the crucifix, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in her expression, something that wasn't entirely her. "The woman in my dreams, she's not of this world. She's something else, something evil, and she's trying to get to me. I can feel her, even now." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows longer. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to get out. But there was something compelling about Helena's story, something that made it impossible to just walk away. I needed to understand what was happening here, even if every fiber of my being told me to leave. "Do the other sisters know about this?" I asked, glancing around the room as if expecting to see something lurking in the dark. Helena nodded slowly. "Some of them, they try to help, but others, they're afraid. They think I'm possessed, or that I've been touched by something unholy. They've been praying for me, but the visions keep coming, stronger every night." I felt a tightness in my chest, the kind that comes from standing too close to the edge of something dangerous. "Have you told anyone outside the convent? A priest? Someone who could help?" Her face darkened, and she shook her head. "They wouldn't understand. They think I was mad. Or worse, they try to take me away. And I can't leave, not yet. Not until I understand what she wants from me." The way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. There was a resignation in her voice, like she had already accepted her fate. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. Whatever was happening to her, it wasn't something that could be easily explained away. It was something ancient, something dark. "I need to see more," I said, almost surprising myself with the words. "I need to understand what's happening here." Helena looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "There's one place, the crypt beneath the convent. I've been too afraid to go down there, but I think that's where she's coming from." I felt my mouth go dry. A crypt. Of course, it had to be a crypt. Every horror story I'd ever heard suddenly felt all too real. But I had come this far, and I couldn't turn back now. "Take me there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Helena hesitated, then nodded. "Follow me." As we made our way back through the corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to shift around us, and every so often, I thought I heard the faintest whisper, like the wind passing through a graveyard. But I forced myself to focus, to push down the growing sense of dread that threatened to overwhelm me. When we finally reached the entrance to the crypt, Helena paused, her hand hovering over the iron latch. "Once we go down there," she said, her voice barely audible, "there's no turning back." I nodded, trying to ignore the icy grip of fear tightening around my heart. "Let's go." With a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy door, and the smell of damp earth and decay hit me like a wave. We stepped into the darkness, and as the door creaked shut behind us, I knew we had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The air in the crypt was suffocating, thick with the scent of damp stone and something far worse: decay, rot, the unmistakable smell of death. The flickering light from Helena's candle cast long, jagged shadows on the walls as we descended the narrow steps, each one creaking ominously under our weight. The stone beneath my feet was cold and uneven, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, most of which belonged to souls long gone. As we reached the bottom, the darkness seemed to close in around us, almost alive in its intensity. The crypt was a labyrinth of narrow passageways and low ceilings, lined with ancient tombs and crumbling statues of saints, their faces worn away by time, leaving them featureless and haunting. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, a rapid, uneven drum in my chest. I forced myself to focus, to keep moving forward, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back, to get out while I still could. Helena walked ahead, her candle trembling in her hand. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she hesitated before each step, as if she was bracing herself for something terrible to happen. I kept close behind her, my eyes darting nervously around the crypt, trying to catch any movement, any sign of life or death. "This way," she whispered, leading me down a particularly narrow corridor that seemed to twist and turn in on itself. The walls felt like they were closing in, the ceiling so low that I had to duck my head to avoid brushing against it. The further we went, the colder it became, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your teeth chatter. Finally, we came to a small, circular chamber, dimly lit by a single, guttering candle set into the wall. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, old and cracked, with dark stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat as I stared at the altar, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was something profoundly wrong about this place, something that felt fundamentally evil. "This is it," Helena said, her voice trembling. "This is where the visions always lead me. It's where she wants me to come." I took a step closer to the altar, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "What happens when you get here?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Helena hesitated, her eyes fixed on the dark stains on the altar. "I don't know. I always wake up before anything happens. But I can feel her, Daniel. I can feel her watching me, waiting for me. And it's getting harder to resist." I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the icy grip of fear that was tightening around my chest. "Helena, we need to leave. We need to get out of here and find someone who can help you." She shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the altar. "It's too late. She's already inside me. I can feel her, growing stronger. And I'm afraid that soon, I won't be able to stop her." Panic surged through me, a cold, electric jolt that sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. I reached out, grabbing her arm. "No, we can't just give up. We have to fight this. There has to be a way to stop her." Helena turned to look at me, and the expression on her face froze the blood in my veins. Her eyes, those deep, haunted eyes, had changed. They were no longer filled with fear or sadness. Instead, they were dark, almost black, and they seemed to shine with a cold, malevolent light. A slow, eerie smile crept across her lips, and I felt my grip on her arm slacken in pure, unadulterated terror. "She's here," Helena whispered, but the voice that came out of her mouth wasn't her own. It was deeper, guttural, like something speaking from the depths of a long-forgotten grave. "And she's hungry." Before I could react, the candle on the wall flickered violently, and then, with a sudden, sharp hiss, it went out, plunging the chamber into complete darkness. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The darkness was absolute, smothering, and in that darkness, I could hear something. No, someone, moving, their footsteps soft but deliberate, circling me. "Helena?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of those footsteps, closer now, echoing in the crypt. I fumbled for my phone, desperately trying to turn on the flashlight, but my hands were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped it. Finally, the light flickered on, weak but better than nothing. I swung it around the chamber, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Helena was gone, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were still there, moving around me, relentless, like a predator stalking its prey. I backed up against the cold stone wall, the phone light shaking as I tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of this place and never look back. But my feet felt like they were rooted to the spot, frozen by the overwhelming fear that gripped me. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, and I felt the blood drain from my face as a cold, cruel whisper filled the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't save her, Daniel. She belongs to me now. The phone slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor, the light flickering wildly before it went out, leaving me alone in the dark with whatever was lurking in the shadows. The darkness was complete, swallowing me whole as I stood there, paralyzed by the terror coursing through my veins. My breathing was ragged, each inhale and exhale a desperate attempt to keep from screaming. I strained to hear something, anything, that would give me a clue as to where Helena had gone, or what had become of her. But there was only silence, thick and suffocating, as if the crypt itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I had to move. Staying there, frozen in fear, was a death sentence. My hands fumbled in the dark, searching blindly for my phone. My fingers brushed against cold stone and damp earth, but I couldn't find the light that had been my last connection to sanity. The whispering voice that had claimed Helena was still echoing in my mind, its malice clinging to me like a shroud. Finally, my hand closed around the phone. I fumbled to turn it on again, and after what felt like an eternity, the faint beam of light flickered back to life. I held it up, sweeping the beam across the crypt. The light was weak, barely penetrating the darkness, but it was enough to see that I was still alone. Helena was gone, and the thought of her out there, lost in the shadows with that thing inside her, made my stomach churn. I took a shaky step forward, my legs trembling beneath me. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run up those stairs and never look back. But something stronger, some irrational pull, kept me rooted to the spot. Helena was still in here somewhere, and I couldn't just leave her to whatever fate awaited her. The beam of my flashlight fell on the altar, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small, dark object lying on the stone surface. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I recognized it, a rosary, its beads glinting dully in the weak light. It was old, the silver crucifix tarnished and worn, but there was something else, something dark and sticky clinging to the beads. Blood. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that this was Helena's rosary. She had been here, standing in this very spot, only moments before everything went wrong. But now she was gone, and all that was left was this blood-stained token. I reached out to pick it up, hesitating only for a second before my fingers closed around the cold metal. As soon as I touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through my hand, up my arm, and into my chest, making me gasp in pain. I dropped the rosary, stumbling back, my heart racing even faster. The rosary lay on the ground, its silver crucifix twisted, as if some unseen force had warped it. I knew then that this wasn't just a simple haunting. Whatever was here, whatever had taken Helena, was far more powerful, far more evil than anything I had ever encountered. And it was toying with me, playing a game I couldn't hope to win. A low, guttural sound echoed through the crypt, making my blood run cold. It was a growl, deep and menacing, reverberating through the walls like the rumble of distant thunder. I turned, the flashlight shaking in my hand, trying to find the source of the sound. The beam swept across the walls, the tombs, the floor, but there was nothing there, nothing that could have made that noise. Then I felt it, cold, icy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. Just the empty crypt, the shadows seeming to pulse and shift around me, as if they were alive. Helena? I called out, my voice cracking with fear. The only answer was the echo of my own voice, bouncing off the stone walls, mocking me. I was alone, or at least, I was the only living thing in that crypt. I forced myself to move, each step heavy and slow, as if I was wading through thick mud. The growling sound came again, closer this time, almost as if it was circling me. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white with the strain. I had to get out of here. I had to find Helena, if she was even still alive. The thought of her being gone, of her body being just another lifeless husk in this place, was too much to bear. The growling stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides. I was trapped, caught in the web of something I couldn't see, couldn't fight. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling with desperation. "Just let me go. Let me help her." For a moment, the breathing stopped, and I dared to hope that whatever was haunting this place had heard me, that it would show some small mercy. But then the laughter started, cold, cruel, inhuman. It echoed off the walls, filling the crypt with its horrible sound. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the uneven stones beneath my feet. As the laughter grew louder, more manic, I turned and ran, the flashlight bobbing wildly in my hand as I sprinted down the narrow corridor. The laughter followed me, growing louder, more twisted, as if it was coming from inside my own head. My breath came in ragged gasps, panic clawing at my throat as I raced for the stairs, desperate to escape the nightmare that had trapped me. But just as I reached the base of the stairs, the light from my flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. I froze, terror gripping me as the laughter faded into a deafening silence. And in that silence, I heard it again, that raspy, inhuman breath, right behind me. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides as I stood there at the base of the stairs, too terrified to move. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with fear, and I could feel the cold, damp air of the crypt seeping into my bones. The inhuman breath was so close that I could almost feel it on the back of my neck, a slow, raspy exhale that sent chills racing down my spine. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I was rooted to the spot, frozen by the sheer terror that had gripped me. I knew something was behind me, something unspeakably evil, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and face it. The laughter still echoed in my mind, that cruel, mocking sound that seemed to resonate from the very walls of the crypt. "Helena," I whispered, barely able to force the words past my lips. My voice sounded small and weak in the vast emptiness, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Then, as if in response to my plea, I heard a faint, muffled sob. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the crypt, distant yet unmistakable. It was Helena. She was still alive. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis, and without thinking, I forced my legs to move, stumbling forward into the darkness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to get the flashlight working again, but the screen remained stubbornly black, refusing to turn on. "Please, God, let this work," I muttered under my breath as I tried again, and finally, the faint glow of the flashlight flickered back to life. It was dimmer than before, the battery nearly drained, but it was enough to cut through the thick shadows that surrounded me. I held the light up, scanning the crypt as I tried to locate the source of Helena's sobbing. The narrow corridors twisted and turned, each one looking more like the last, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was completely lost. The layout of the crypt made no sense, a nightmarish maze designed to trap anyone foolish enough to enter. Every corner I turned seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth, further from any hope of escape. But Helena was out there somewhere, and I couldn't leave her behind. The sobbing grew louder as I moved forward, a heartbreaking sound that tugged at something deep inside me. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was a desperation to it, a plea for help that I couldn't ignore. I had to find her before it was too late. I followed the sound, the light from my phone casting eerie shadows on the walls. The crypt seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the very stones vibrating with some unseen energy. As I turned another corner, the sobbing suddenly stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that made my blood run cold. "Helena?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was the soft echo of my own voice, bouncing back at me from the stone walls. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me as I realized how utterly alone I was in this nightmare. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, movement in the shadows, just beyond the reach of my light. I turned quickly, shining the flashlight in the direction of the movement, but there was nothing there. The darkness seemed to ripple, as if something was lurking just out of sight, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My heart pounded in my chest as I edged forward, the light shaking in my trembling hand. The corridor ahead was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. I could hear my own pulse, a loud, frantic drumbeat in my ears as I pressed on, each step taking me deeper into the unknown. And then I heard it again, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. It wasn't the sobbing this time. It was a whisper, so soft that I could barely make it out, but it was there, carried on the cold, stale air. I strained to hear, trying to make sense of the words, but they were too distorted, too garbled to understand. But one thing was clear. It wasn't Helena's voice. It was something else, something far darker, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but that filled me with a primal dread. I stopped, every muscle in my body tensing as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was all around me now, coming from every direction at once, a chorus of disembodied voices that seemed to be closing in on me. I whipped the flashlight around, the beams slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing to see, just the endless, suffocating blackness. Suddenly, the light flickered, dimming further until it was barely more than a faint glow. I cursed under my breath, shaking the phone as if that would somehow coax more life out of it, but the light continued to fade. Panic surged through me as the whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I was no longer alone. I spun around, desperate to find an exit, but the crypt seemed to shift around me, the walls closing in, the corridors twisting and turning into a maddening maze. The whispers reached a crescendo, a cacophony of voices that made my head spin, and in that moment, I knew. Whatever had taken Helena was coming for me next. The light finally gave out, plunging me into total darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving me in a silence that was somehow worse. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel the cold, malevolent presence drawing closer, suffocating me with its sheer intensity. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move, rooted to the spot by an invisible force. Then, out of the darkness, I felt it again. Those icy fingers brushing against my skin, this time wrapping around my wrist with a grip like iron. I gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened, yanking me forward into the black void. And then, I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, burning with a malevolent light, staring back at me from the darkness. The glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto mine with a cold, predatory stare. They were impossibly bright, like twin flames burning in the void, and I couldn't look away. My body was paralyzed with fear, every muscle frozen as those eyes drew closer, their light illuminating nothing but the void around them. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, as if a hand was squeezing it shut, choking off any chance of escape. The eyes moved steadily towards me, each step they took echoing in the silent crypt until they were right in front of me. The cold grip on my wrist tightened, and I could feel the icy tendrils of whatever this thing was creeping up my arm, seeping into my skin like a poison. A voice, low, guttural, and impossibly ancient, whispered into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. Asterisk, you cannot run. You cannot hide. You are mine. Asterisk, the words echoed in my skull, filling me with a terror so profound that I thought my heart might stop. I was drowning in the darkness, trapped in the gaze of those hellish eyes, and I knew this was the end. I was going to die here, in this cursed crypt, my soul consumed by whatever monstrosity had taken Helena. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of light. It was faint, barely a glimmer, but it was there. Hope, fragile as it was, flared inside me, and I forced my head to turn, straining against the invisible force that held me in place. The light grew stronger, pushing back the darkness, and I realized with a shock that it was coming from the rosary, the one I had dropped earlier. The crucifix, twisted and blood-stained, was glowing with an ethereal light, casting long shadows on the walls of the crypt. The malevolent presence hissed in fury, recoiling from the light, and I felt the grip on my wrist loosen just enough for me to yank my arm free. My body was still trembling, but I forced myself to move, lunging toward the rosary with everything I had left. As soon as my fingers closed around the cold metal, a surge of warmth spread through me, driving back the chill that had settled in my bones. The light from the crucifix flared brighter, filling the crypt with a holy radiance that sent the shadows scurrying into the corners, the eyes blinking out of existence as if they had never been there. I stumbled back, clutching the rosary to my chest, gasping for air as the oppressive weight that had surrounded me began to lift. The whispers were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow more comforting than terrifying. The light from the crucifix pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and I felt a sense of clarity returning, as if the fog that had clouded my mind was finally starting to clear. But Helena was still missing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I forced myself to my feet, the rosary clutched tightly in my hand. The light it emitted was steady now, bright enough to push back the darkness that still lurked at the edges of the crypt. I had to find her. I had to get her out of this place before it was too late. I took a few tentative steps forward, the light guiding my way through the twisting corridors. The crypt was still as disorienting as ever, but the panic that had gripped me before was gone, replaced by a single-minded determination. Whatever had taken her was still here. I could feel it lurking just beyond the reach of the light, watching, waiting for another chance to strike. But I wouldn't give it one, not if I could help it. The corridor opened up into a larger chamber, and I froze as I saw what lay within. Helena was there, kneeling before a large stone sarcophagus in the center of the room, her head bowed as if in prayer. But there was something wrong. Her posture was too rigid, too unnatural, and I could see the faint tremor in her hands as they clutched at the edge of the sarcophagus. "Helena?" I called out, my voice echoing off the stone walls. She didn't respond, didn't even look up. I moved closer, the light from the crucifix illuminating the chamber, and as I approached, I could see her lips moving, whispering something under her breath. The same guttural, ancient language that had filled my mind earlier. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. She was still under its control, still trapped in whatever nightmare this place had woven around her. I had to break the connection, had to pull her back before it was too late. "Helena, you have to stop," I shouted, rushing toward her. The light flared brighter as I reached out, grabbing her shoulder, shaking her. Her body was cold, unnaturally so, and her eyes, when they finally looked up at me, were filled with a void so deep it made my blood run cold. The entity that had taken her snarled, an inhuman sound that reverberated through the chamber, and I felt the force of it push back against the light. But I held on, refusing to let go, refusing to let it take her. "You are stronger than this," I said, my voice firm, even as the darkness closed in around us. "Fight it, Helena. You have to fight it." Her eyes flickered, the void retreating slightly, and I saw a glimmer of the real Helena beneath the surface. But the entity wasn't done yet. The chamber shook, the walls trembling as a deep, rumbling growl echoed through the crypt. The light from the crucifix flickered, the shadows pressing in, and I could feel the malevolent presence gathering its strength for one final push. "Helena, please," I shouted, desperation clawing at me. "Come back to me." The light from the crucifix flared one last time, brighter than the sun, and I felt the darkness recoil, hissing and snarling as it was driven back. The force of it nearly knocked me off my feet, but I held on, pulling Helena with me as the entity's grip finally broke. She collapsed against me, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive weight of the malevolent presence gone, but I didn't let go of her, didn't stop clutching the rosary like a lifeline. "Daniel," Helena's voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was her voice, no longer twisted by the entity that had tried to take her. "I'm here," I said, my own voice shaking with relief. "I'm here. It's over." She looked up at me, her eyes clear for the first time, and a single tear slid down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't say anything, just held her tighter, feeling the warmth of the light still emanating from the rosary. It wasn't over, not completely. I knew that whatever had been in this place was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for another chance. But for now, we were safe. We had survived. And as I helped Helena to her feet, guiding her toward the faint glimmer of dawn filtering through the crypt's entrance, I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. If you like this supernatural story, subscribe, like, and comment, and see the next supernatural horror story.